All right, well, welcome to our last week here of angels, spirit beings, angelology. This has been a fun class. It's been one of my most interesting to teach, but they all turn out that way. So, but I've really enjoyed going through this with you. As I sat down to land the plane, so to speak, I've got my longest outline. I have a 6-page, but we're going to go through this one pretty quickly. I was hoping to be able to say that without Dan in the room. I've been giving him such a hard time the last couple of weeks about landing the plane. But basically, I have just a few verses on page 1 for us to go through, and then I copied an article from a man named Don Stewart about the angel of the Lord. Bill asked a question about 2 Kings chapter 1, and we had a very short little blurb about the angel of the Lord. I'm not going to teach that, but it's a great article for you to read. I'll point out the salient points about recognizing the angel of Jehovah from the Old Testament. And it's not really a study for angelology because technically it's not an angel. It is, I believe, a theophanic appearance of the second person of the Trinity. And he does a really good job of saying why. He's got 6 points about references of the angel of the Lord receiving worship and telling the future, forgiving sin, things that only God can do. And then there are times when the angel of the Lord would act, and then later on in the passage it would refer back to something that God did or God said that the angel of the Lord just did. So I think the scriptures are telling us that the angel of the Lord is deity. And because of the phrase, no man has seen God at any time, I think that applies to the Father, because we're told very clearly that the Son is the expression of God in the flesh. And so if God was going to manifest himself, I think he would manifest the second person of the Trinity in the Old Testament to be consistent with the way he manifested himself in the New Testament. So I don't think any man has seen God the Father yet. So I think that's yet to come. And I think that's what that scripture is. But we'll go through that here in a little bit. But I wanted us to go through the final exam. Again, I just added 5 multiple choice questions to give us some good takeaways from the lessons that we've had after the midterm. But let's go ahead and get some of the information out of the way. Let's go through our matching. Recognize these answers can be used more than once. Which one of our selections on the right is number 1? Terms are hosts, sons of God, and watchers. Those are all descriptions of what type of spirit being? So that would be angels. F, that's correct. The anointed cherub that covereth describes which one of our choices? That's E, Satan. That's correct. 4 faces and 4 wings? That's cherubim. 1 face and 6 wings? That's B, seraphim. Outranked by Lucifer. That's going to be G, Michael the archangel. Now, others, of course, would apply because I think everything on that list except for Satan would apply. But specifically, we're referring to the passage in Jude 9, where Michael durst not give him a railing accusation. Angels who influence world leaders are specifically, that's C, thrones and dominions. Yes, that's what we call those. Which one of these do not have wings? Angels. So we could say C, D, and F, but of course F gets the point across. Angels, yes. Guardians of the holiness of God. That's A, cherubim. That's what we see as their main duty. A name for the angels signifying their rank and power. That was D. Principalities and powers. Principalities and powers. Whereas thrones and dominions would be more of their function.
I just read it wrong.
Yeah, thrones and dominions would be more of function than a description of angels themselves. And what's the name that signifies a fiery serpent or heralds of God's holiness? That's seraph. That's correct. Very good. All right, true and false. True and false. What is, angels were involved in the discipline of Nebuchadnezzar. True. That was true. So that was one of their duties in the Old Testament, was to carry out discipline, and that's going to be reinstated. We're going to see that tonight. That's going to be reinstated in the kingdom from the heavens. Angels will again be carrying out God's discipline. Paul says that believers wrestle against principalities and powers. That is also true. Ephesians 6. The term sons of God is used for angels and denotes armies.
What did you say 12 was?
12 is true.
It says we wrestle not against
Flesh and blood.
flesh and blood. Oh,
But
Read the sentence.
yeah, I didn't.
against principalities and powers.
Okay.
That's okay. You caught it. 13 is false because the term for angels that denotes armies would be what word? The hosts. Yes, when we see the hosts of God, we want us to think of a lot and in ranks, as in armies. That's a translation of that English word hosts. So when we see hosts, you should think military, ranking, a lot. And so instead of sons of God, we would say hosts there. That's why 13 is false. 14, the angels have learned everything they will ever learn.
False.
That is false. That's good. We spent a week on God, all the things that God is doing to try to teach the spirit beings. 15, Lucifer was allowed to convince 1/3 of the angels to follow him when he fell. That was true. Right, Art?
I read 1/2.
Oh.
I put false because I thought 1/2, so I knew it was 1/3.
Well, that's my fault. The font was too small there. I'm going to take the hit on that one. All right. What is it that angels of God strongly desire to look into according to Peter's epistle?
B.
God's plan for the believer. That's correct. Time of God's return, no one knows, even the spirit beings. The devil's destiny, that's kind of interesting. But we're not told they're interested in that. And I think so many of them are oblivious of that. I think they're deceived. They have that satanic deception, that satanic blindness where they actually think they can win. And that's why they serve. 17, what word describes the stage that is being set for God to use the church to teach the spirit beings about himself? So A
and C
would be correct, as well as B, as well as C. So I put all three of those words in the outline. The Greek word is theatron in one passage, and it's spectacle. The two English words were spectacle and gazing stock in the two passages that we looked at. So that's why all three would apply there. Paul says that we've been made a spectacle and we've been made a gazing stock, and the Greek word is theatron, which is our word for theater. So again, that just kind of gives you a picture of God playing this out in view of spirit beings. It's being watched. They are reacting in real time to things that happen, and there's education going on there. What phrase most accurately describes how Satan is using the world system to distract the world population? C is correct. We would see A, B, and D as acts of the sin nature more appropriately. So the answer would be C, cradling the world. The verse is 1 John 5:19, and again, it's difficult to see in the English because it says the world lieth in wickedness. And it's better translated, I believe, the world is lieth in the wicked one, in the evil one. I think it's talking not about wickedness as a neuter thing, but as a specific entity in the world is lying in the evil one himself. Which of these activities, 19, describe how believers would interact with angels today? That's correct. God would not be using angels to deliver his message. He has, it's interesting, he actually calls them angels in Revelation, but those are, again, I don't believe the angel to the church at Thyatira is talking about a spirit being. I think it's talking about the pastor, the recognized leader of that church. And I think that's something that's interesting, that in that passage of Scripture, God has a recognized authority in the churches, in the areas, someone that he gives messages to and empowers. But yes, entertaining angels unawares would be how we would interact with angels today. Seeing God's glory is more, and again, I put those answers in there specifically. Hearing God's message is, Paul said, the foolishness of preaching. So that's from our human spiritual gifts, the teacher and the pastor-teacher. Seeing God's glory is what happens when believers live out God's desirous will for their life. That's what Jesus said in the upper room. He said, glorify me, and so that I can be glorified in them. And how was that going to happen? When each of those men in that room carried out God's desirous will for their life, God's glory was revealed through them. So again, God uses the church to reveal his glory nowadays. And then receiving God's law, that's through Scripture, through revealed revelation already. So whereas God may have used angels for those things in the past, none of those things would apply in this dispensation today. We would entertain angels unawares. And 20, which of these phrases describe what fallen angels or demons are doing today? All the above. And the demons are doing each one of those things. They have a key role in running the world system. They are influencing rulers. They are opposing believers by placing obstacles. They seek to do God's will. One of those obstacles, I really think, is we saw what Satan did to Job, right? That sometimes affliction, disease, injury, pain, soreness, I think God allows those things to test us. I think that's a little bit of what Paul was going through. This messenger from Satan to buffet him was some kind of affliction. I think it affected his eyesight. That's some opinion, but I think it was some kind of physical attack that God allows to try to keep us from, on the demon side, to try to keep us from seeing and doing God's will. I hate to be very specific, but this has been a class that Brooke has been super excited about. Ever since she's been wanting to go to learn about angels, she's been looking forward to this. And I think physically, the spirit beings are just the demons. She's under attack. This is a physical attack. So I think it happens. All right. Well, there's your answers there. Hopefully you got some good takeaways, and this is information that I think now is in your brain, and it's something that I think you'll be able to use. Let's take a look at some of our other verses in our summary outline. These will tie up some loose ends. Again, it was none of these I want to go too deeply into. They didn't really fit exactly in the outline. Dan brought up 1 Corinthians 6:3 last week. We did talk about a little bit about what angels were doing, carrying out God's discipline, but we didn't notice the fact that it says in 1 Corinthians 6:3, know not that we shall judge angels. How much more things that pertain to this life. Paul's talking to believers, and he's giving them a little bit of information about what's to come. And believers, I think, are going to be part of the ruling party in the kingdom from the heavens. Those of us in this room that are believers, the next thing to happen is the rapture of the church. We will have the marriage supper of the Lamb. We'll have the Bema seat. I don't know in what order that happens. I think the Bema seat probably comes first. Marriage supper of the Lamb. And then what next? well, then we come back on white horses at the end of the tribulation period when we're a part then of God's army. And I think based upon how faithful we were in this time period on earth, we will be given a duty in that 1,000 years. And part of that will be carrying out God's justice, I think. And so we will have at our beck and call, at our disposal, I think, some spirit beings to help carry out that justice. This is something that God is going to be expecting us. I don't think we're going to sit around, on clouds with harps and just watching what's going on. I don't think we're going to be bored. I think we are going to be servants. I think we're going to be used. But we'll have glorified bodies. Our sin natures will be taken care of. I think there'll be a different kind of believer. We won't have these bodies of limitation anymore. But as it pertains to angels, we'll have angels to order around. We will judge angels. I think we will be used there. Angels of God ministered to God's people. Here's one of the examples. We see this actually several times through Scripture. Jacob went his way, and the angels of God met him and ministered to him. We see that they did that to Jesus after he was tempted from Satan. So God remember Jacob's dream? He put his head, on the rock and saw the angels ascending and descending, going up to heaven. I think God kind of gave him a peek behind the curtain of how God was using the spirit beings at that time with Jacob's ladder there. We have in Matthew 18, verse 10, "Take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones, for I say unto you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven." So I think God has assigned spirit beings to his people. And I think God has boundaries set on our life. We see that, I think, in Romans chapter 8 with the use of the term predestination. I think all predestination is God is familiar, foreknowledge. He's familiar with his creation, and he has set a hard boundary in my life. There are things that can happen and things that he has said will not happen. And he's made sure that I'm not going to accidentally stumble into it. The days of my life are ordered by the Lord, and I'm not going to accidentally, clumsily drive myself off the road and kill myself. My angel's going to keep me alive, and he's going to keep me from messing that up. And so I think we have our own angel keeping watch over us. Angels are invested on what happens here on earth. They're not just quiet, silent observers either. We see here in Luke 15:10, "Likewise I say unto you, there's joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth." So when someone believes the facts of the gospel, there's joy in heaven. And again, this is them involved, paying attention, learning from the church. This was even before the church. This was in the Gospels, that they were invested and interested in what was happening here on earth. And again, there's not this separation of there and here. Because I think when we get that separation of there and here, well, we get egocentric about what happens here, that this is all about us. No, God is involved in his physical universe. God is involved in his creation, and his spirit beings are also involved. Part of the angel's duties, I don't think we mentioned this, Luke chapter 16, is to carry the believer's soul and spirit into God's presence. We saw this from the story of the rich man and Lazarus. "And it came to pass that the beggar died, was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried." So this transportation process, we're ushered into God's presence by his messengers. And that's going to be an exciting thing. Again, we don't have to look at death the same way that the world system looks at death. The believer looks at death as a cashing in of interest and principal. We get it all. To live is Christ. There's a profit to living here on earth. Like Paul says, for me to live is Christ, but to die would be gain. I get the principal and the interest. I get it all when I go to heaven. I cash it in, and I get to realize my profit when I go to heaven. That's what Paul was saying there. Something else too, the angels do not have a lifespan the way that humans do. They're created beings. They're going to serve their purpose. Whether their purpose, again, is to be one of the fallen and to be in the lake of fire with the devil, or the believers. Luke 20:36. Neither can they die anymore, for they are equal to the angels, and our children are the children of God, being the children of the resurrection. This is a phrase that we have there. All right, so those are the verses that I kind of wanted to peek into. Any questions about spirit beings themselves? Any questions about the cherubim, the seraphim, angels? Because now we have this article that I just wanted to go over very quickly with you about the angel of the Lord, the angel of Jehovah in the Old Testament. But are there any questions, comments about spirit beings?
The angel is assigned to a child. What if that kid's never saved? At a certain age, is the angel possibly pulled away from him?
So I tend to think that there is a difference when a spirit being looks at an unbeliever who's elect and an unbeliever who's destined to be an unbeliever. And I think there's a difference. I don't know what it is. The sealing hasn't happened yet, but I think there is an authority from God basically saying, hey, this one's off limits. We're going to take care of this one. And so I think that's basically what Jesus was talking about. He was saying, hey, be careful. Got to treat kids, treat them better. Don't despise one of these little ones. They're being looked out for. I don't have a lot to say about. There's just not a lot of revelation. It would all be conjecture on my part about these kids that are destined to grow up. What were we talking about? Vessels of honor, vessels of dishonor. There are individuals that are going to grow up and become unbelievers. And I think God's aware of this. He's not caught by surprise. He knows that now I believe we've talked about this too. I think there comes a time when they've said no for the last time to the gospel that God blots their name out of the Lamb's Book of Life. So until that happens, I don't know. Maybe they're off limits. But it's just a maybe.
These are Jewish kids too.
Well, that's true.
It's not the church.
That's true. Again, this was before the dispensation of grace. But I think we see God using the spirit beings to keep an eye on us.
I sure hope so. I'll be in trouble.
What do you guys think? I mean, it's really conjecture. There's not a lot of revelation on that.
What we can say is just, I've always said, we only go as far as the Bible goes and say what the Bible says, and it's silent in a lot of these areas, so it's best just to be silent and realize that God knows what he's doing.
I don't like to take a lot of these.
That's how Calvinists go off the edge.
Yeah, I don't want to take a lot of these individual things that are true and try to assemble them into something that builds a house of cards.
They take the next logical step, which is right off the cliff.
And I think that's dangerous. Yeah, I think you're going to do that. So I can't be authoritative. So, anybody else? All right, well, let's take a look at Don Stewart's article here. He raises the question, who is the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament? And he gives three possibilities. And I think he takes these possibilities from what people actually believe. That there was a mighty angel that had a specific kind of like an archangel, but unnamed, that did a lot of important things, because we see him popping up a lot in the Old Testament. The angel from Jehovah. Sorry about that. I didn't think about the staple until after I was getting ready to pop holes in it. Secondly, God the Father assuming a human body, or thirdly, God the Son taking a body for a short period of time. Each of these three views has its supporters. To determine which view best fits the evidence, we will consider some of the major appearances of the angel of the Lord and make some observations. So I think when you look at, there's several in Genesis, right? And then I think the first four are Genesis. Then we have Moses in the burning bush. We have Joshua, Gideon, Samson's parents. And I think when we look at those visits, we see some things, the way they responded. These people thought they'd seen God. And we see, again, a case for what we would call theophany. I've actually heard it called a huiophany, an appearance of the Son. A theo is Greek for God. Huios is Greek for the Son. So I've actually heard it. Instead of used as theophany, a more precise word would be huiophany. But let's take a look at the 6. I think this is on the back of page 2, entering to the front of page 3. Case for theophany, a temporary appearance of God in the body or the Son. Number 1, it's identified with God. The angel of the Lord is identified with God. Second, has the power to give life. That's back in Genesis 16. Only God has this power. There's an all-knowing quality in the angel of the Lord in a couple of different passages. The angel of the Lord is called the judge of all the earth in 18:25 of Genesis. He has the power to forgive sin, and we see the angel of the Lord doing this in Exodus 23. Receiving worship, and I think this is where I'm pretty convinced the angel of the Lord received worship multiple times, and angels would have stopped that. Angels would have said, "Don't worship me," because angels would have been very careful not to take glory that belonged to God. That was very dangerous. That was actually Nebuchadnezzar's sin. Remember, and then what was the other king who took God's glory and was struck dead right then? There was another king that happened to. Who was that? Belteshazzar. Could have been him. I'm trying to remember. I don't. Was it Herod? Worms ate him? Was it? Well, it might have been Herod that I'm thinking of. Yeah. So I think angels would have been very careful not to take glory that belonged to God. And so I believe that when we see the angel of Jehovah used in the Old Testament, that most of the time, and I say it that way because there's a couple of times where I think the Bible lets us know that this is not deity. And he says that on the very back page. Context must determine. Actually, near the bottom of the last page, we see other occasions. Though the angel of the Lord, or the angel from Jehovah, is sometimes identified with the Lord himself, there are other times when they're distinguished. So we can conclude that sometimes the angel of the Lord was God himself, while at other times he was merely a messenger sent from Jehovah. And if the context bears that out, then we don't need to force it. If there's something specifically that's mentioned that says it's not the angel from Jehovah, then we just say it's an angel from Jehovah. But I think we definitely see enough in these other instances that when a distinguishing mark is not made, the context usually determines that, yes, we're seeing deity in a human form, a temporary human form. Now, this differs from the incarnation in several ways. It differs from the incarnation because there was no birth, there was no transfer of nature, there's no human nature, there's no what we would call hypostatic union of two natures, the way we had when Mary gave birth with the virgin birth. We just here have the temporary assumption of a human form, which is one of the powers that angels have and one of the powers that God has. So I'll leave that there for you guys to look over and to dig into detail. It was an often used term in the Old Testament, the angel from the Lord. So I'm glad that Bill brought it up. Thank you for your participation and suggestions. I think it added to the study. All right. Well, we'll wrap up our study. Again, it was enjoyable. Tune in next week. We're going to have a double dose of Women from the Bible. Women of the Bible. We'll give our introduction and then dive right in. Pastor's going to be gone out of town. So I've got the first 2 hours next week. And if you have any friends that you think might enjoy the study, reach out and invite them. As you can see, we have a couple of empty seats. All right. Well, let's take a break, and then we'll let Dan, if he's ready to wrap things up, we'll let him go.